Joining us now to talk about the threat from IS and why some in the West are joining the extremist group is the best-selling author and scholar of religions, Reza Aslan. Reza, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let's look at that broad question. What is driving some young men brought up in Western societies, educated largely in Western schools, to join groups like IS in Iraq and Syria or al-Nusra in Syria?
Well, in some ways, it's very much the same kind of sentiment that brought young men throughout the 60s and the 70s to join insurgent groups around the world in Latin America and in Western Asia. Primarily, it's this kind of romantic fantasy, a sense of excitement, a sense of adventure. But also it has to do with, I think, a sense of dispossession, a longing for a firm identity that many Muslims in Europe, particularly in places like the UK and in France and Germany, have. As many scholars, as many sociologists and journalists have reported over the last decade, life for a lot of Muslims in Western Europe has not been easy. There has been a sense of a lack of belonging, if you will, and in some ways ISIS presents a ready-made identity, a member of a global movement that is quite appealing to a lot of these individuals. But I do think I just want to emphasize that we shouldn't simply discount the sort of youthful sense of romanticism and adventure that ISIS provides to a lot of these kids.
So you say it's driven by idealism, religious motivation to a large extent. We had one analyst writing in the online magazine Slate who says actually these recruits are, as he put it, thrill-seeking psychopaths.
I think thrill-seeking is a good way of putting it, who are looking for a sense of adventure, an exotic experience. And so you see them taking selfies of themselves holding their brand new weapons. They feel as though they are part of some grand project to recreate the globe as they know it. And so all of those things are deeply a part of it. It's not just a religious motivation, though certainly religion, insofar as it informs their identity, plays a role.
And we had another comparison, which was made in that report we just saw by an analyst, and she says it's the same thing we study with gang research, that people may have a lack of social ties or bonds that are connecting them to whatever their stereotypical culture would be.
Yes, I've read a number of reports that make that same conclusion, that draw a parallel between reasons why certain perhaps socioeconomically depressed or dispossessed individuals join gangs in order to have a sense of collective belonging. That same experience is very much alive in these individuals who go to ISIS. I mean, the one thing that's, I think, really interesting and unique about what the Islamic State has done is that in creating this, imaginary idea of the caliphate and in actually capturing certain land and territory that they can call their own, they've created the sense that they're reimagining a utopian society, one that is very much a part of their imaginations about a perfected, unadulterated Islamic past that they are trying to recreate. And as you can imagine, for a lot of people, particularly those who feel as though they have been marginalized by their own societies, this is a pretty appealing message. And that's why we're seeing hundreds of individuals, primarily from Western Europe, leave everything behind and go to Syria or Iraq to join this conflict.
So we might have some individuals who feel marginalized, who feel disaffected, alienated. But I was wondering, to what extent does Western foreign policy play in this?
This is something that groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have absolutely mastered over the last decade or so. And what they've done is that they've managed to tap into these global grievances that people, not just Muslims, but that people all over the world have in order to draw disparate groups to their cause. And Now, these grievances themselves are legitimate grievances, but I do think it's important to understand that they are not real grievances for a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. When you look at, for instance, bin Laden's statements and writings, as I've written about before, you know, bin Laden complained about global warming. He complained about American campaign finance laws. I can pretty much assure you that bin Laden couldn't have cared less about either of these things, but he understood that particularly young people who are politically active, who are motivated, who have a far more romantic sense of destiny and this notion of global transformation, that those kinds of complaints, those kinds of grievances make them feel as though there is some connection between them and these organizations half a world away. It's a way of drawing an audience to them. So, as I and many other analysts have said, it's not enough simply to destroy ISIS militants. That's an important aspect. These militants have to be militarily confronted, but that's not enough. You also need to address the grievances that fuel the kind of appeal that a group like ISIS has, particularly to young people in Europe.
Right, and those grievances are mainly in Europe and countries like the United States, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And, you know, I think it's important that we do not exaggerate the draw that a group like ISIS has had. I believe the high-end numbers that I have seen is that up to 500 Europeans may have joined ISIS. That may seem like a large number, but it's an infinitesimally small number when it comes to the number of Muslims that actually exist in Western Europe. But you're absolutely right. A young Muslim of a particular political or social persuasion, this is a very powerful propaganda message that ISIS is providing.
So what we're looking at here, from what you're telling us, is that Islamic State, a group like that, has a pretty sophisticated recruitment strategy to get Westerners from countries like, say, Britain or the United States or France or even Denmark to come to their aid, to fight for them.
Absolutely. This is a globalized movement that functions very much in the globalized age. They are masters of propaganda. They've done a wonderful job using social media in order to present their message to disparate corners of the world. And more interestingly, I think that, you know, we talk a lot about Westerners that have been recruited by ISIS. We don't talk about what exactly they are recruited to do. Let's just be honest here. ISIS doesn't need another guy holding a gun. What they need is English speakers, German speakers, French speakers who are a product of the globalized world, who are familiar with the landscape of social media, and who can communicate to other potential recruits in a language that they understand. That's what becomes so important about drawing Westerners to this cause, because those Westerners become the bridge to even more recruits into ISIS.
There is another theory we've heard, and this is one we've heard on the U.S. public television news program Frontline, which says that one of the reasons the ISIS or IS recruitment campaign has resonance with young people is that there is now a generational divide between Al-Qaeda, which was the old threat, and IS, which is now the new threat, and people identify more with IS because they see people just like themselves on the front lines there.
Absolutely. Much has been made about the fact that, you know, this group, the so-called Islamic State, is so violent that even Al-Qaeda has denounced them. And that's an extraordinary statement, but what it belies is this competition that has erupted, and a generational one, as you rightly said, between Al-Qaeda and a group like ISIS. The fact of the matter is that Al-Qaeda, which really gave birth to this jihadist movement in the 1990s, has, for instance, been talking about recreating the caliphate for more than 20 years. ISIS has done it in 2 years. Now, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a symbolic gesture. But that symbolism actually matters. To be able to stand up and say that we have done what Muslims have wanted to do for nearly 100 years, recreate the caliphate, that we actually have land that we can call our own, something Al-Qaeda never had, that we have our own resources, that we don't need money from you know, Qatar or Saudi Arabia, that we have our own money, that we are actually creating a state structure, a bureaucracy, that we are governing in a way that Al-Qaeda could never do. That is not just a powerful statement for potential recruits. It's also if you will, a stick in the eye of Al-Qaeda.
What kind of a threat does IS pose to countries like the United States, but right back here in the United States, say in Washington or New York, or maybe in London, or maybe in Paris? We're hearing more and more from leaders in these countries that they do pose a threat to us right here. We heard Eric Holder, the U.S. Attorney General, saying that it's something that gives us really extreme concern. In some ways, it's more frightening than anything I have seen as Attorney General.
Yes, well, as a matter of fact, I mean, what we've seen, a recent poll that came out in the United States that said 90% of Americans are worried about an ISIS attack on the United States. That is a gravely exaggerated threat. I am not saying that ISIS doesn't have eventual designs to expand their territory and even into Europe and the United States. Sure, that's what they would like. But whether they are able to do that is a completely different issue. They do have the financial resources necessary to create the kind of massive terrorist attacks that we saw in 2005 in the UK or in 2001 in the United States. Money is important if you want to do those kinds of things. And the one thing that ISIS has is money, millions and millions of dollars at its disposal. However, by all the intelligence analysts that I have seen and I have talked to, everyone has said more or less that currently ISIS, which is really only a few thousand individuals right now, is very much embroiled in the territory of Iraq and Syria, has yet to make any kind of indication that they have transnational terrorist ambitions that can be realized in the immediate future.
Okay, we've seen one Western strategy to counter the growth of IS, and that is bomb IS. Is there any evidence to show us that there might be another strategy like the one you were talking about, of dealing with the grievances back home, back in these Western countries, back in Western Europe, back in the United States?
It's very important that this organization, ISIS, which presents itself as addressing Sunni grievances against the Shia government, be confronted by Iraqi Sunnis. And there's every reason to believe that that is something that is in the cards, that will happen. But secondly, we need to address these grievances, both the grievances in Iraq, but with a more inclusive government, one that is not just a part of a broader Shiification of the country that we've seen over the last few years, but one that includes Sunnis in major government ministries, perhaps defense ministries or oil ministries, ministries that actually matter. And then, of course, we have to deal with Syria. That's a whole other issue. I don't think anyone has an answer to that one.
Reza, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us, sir.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.